Okay, good evening, everyone. My name's Adam. If I haven't met you before, I know some folks weren't doing last term. Is there anyone who was not doing last term who I haven't met before? But we've met before, so that's cool. Yeah, some new faces. Excellent. Good day, sir. Alrighty, well, today we're going to do the law. I am the law. That was Judge Dredd. He did not appear in the Bible. He wasn't one of the judges. But we are going to do the law tonight. And as you probably briefly saw last week, that there are different genres of writing in the Bible. And so if we're looking at different genres of writing, there's the book of the law, which we're going to talk about tonight. There's narratives, there's prophetic writings, there's wisdom literature, and of course there's poetry. So these are all different kinds, and next week we're going to look at some other kinds. We're going to look at prophetic literature and poetry, but this week we're going to look at the law. And the thing with the law is it's not a law book. I had the privilege of going into Parliament last year, and when you go into Parliament, you see the law books, the laws that have been created. These are not books you'd want to take home and read. These are very heavy, green leather-bound volumes of law. There's no narrative there. There's no journey that it takes you on. It's just the law. And we don't find that in the Bible. In the Bible, the law is presented interspersed with the story of the people of God, of God's relating to others. And so tonight we're going to look at the law. We're going to look at how the author first intended it to be understood. That's going to be my role now. As Moses handed the law to the people, how were they meant to understand it? And then in the second session, Mike's going to take us through how, as Christians, we should understand the law from the Old Testament. That will be the second session. Okay, so in the Old Testament, there is 5 books which are kind of known as the law, and we'll look at that again a bit more briefly. But as I said, they're interspersed into the narrative. And so included in the books of the law is, for example, Genesis, Exodus. Now, these are big storybooks of the Bible. I mean, some of your big stories are in those books. Numbers, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, basically the whole of Moses' experience in the scriptures is found in those books. And so any stories relating to him, we get from those books. The early life of guys like Joshua and Caleb is in those books. We've got Joseph, we've got Adam, Eve, Noah. All these people are found in those books, and these are the books of the law. Why is it all mixed up like that? Why is there history in there with the law? And the truth is that the law can't be understood outside of the relationship that man has with God. And so when we read something like, we're looking at the law in context, when we read something like, you shall have no other gods before me. Well, this makes sense when you realize that they've just been taken out of a land where they were slaves to a people, a culture that had over 1,500 gods. It's more than 4 gods for every day of the year. The Egyptians had a crazy truckload of gods, and they had gods for everything, every kind of social activity, every kind of sort of abstract concept that you could think of, there was a god for that thing. And so they come out of that, and what's the thing that God says to them? God, I'm one. You're not going to have any other gods before me. There's just me. He's trying to introduce them to a really new concept. They've been living in slavery for hundreds of years. Their children have grown up in that culture, and they've seen these many gods. And so the narrative enlightens us regarding why that command is given in the way it's given to the people that it's given to. The Egyptian gods also were not like God. Like the Roman gods, like the Greek gods, they were crude caricatures of broken, frail men. The gods would bicker, they would fight, had rivalries between them, brothers would kill each other. I mean, the gods of the Egyptians, the Romans, the Greeks, they were trashy gods. And God is setting himself apart from that kind of thing. He said, I'm not that kind of God. He's the God of gods. And so he talks about himself in that way. In Deuteronomy says, "For the Lord your God is God of gods, Lord of lords, the great, the mighty, the awesome God, who is not partial and takes no bribes." In other words, he's saying, I'm not a corruptible God. I'm not like the gods you saw played out in Egypt there, where there was trashy gods who were always taking bribes and just doing whatever, they fancied for whoever gave them the most pleasure or praise. I'm not that kind of God. And so when we understand the context, the narrative context of these laws as they're handed down, it gives us more understanding of the things that are said. Christians are very fond of saying, obviously all the other gods aren't really real. This is a little off topic, it's a sidebar, but the Bible never says that. The Bible just says that the gods of the nations are worthless, which is a different thing to say. We say they're not real, but then what happens is we get into this mindset where there's only God. And he's got no one competing against him. But that's not the reality we live in. We live in a spiritual world where there are principalities, powers. There are things that exalt themselves against the knowledge of Christ, even in the new. We experience that. There are things that would want to call themselves gods. God is the God of all those. He's a great God. And so when we see it in the story, when we see it in the narrative, we understand it. Another example we could look at, it says, "You shall not murder." Now, obviously, that sounds like great advice. But how do we define murder? What do we call it? Well, when you understand that the first brothers, the one killed the other, you realize that murder is a big issue. Why is murder different when you kill a man to killing an animal? Well, it's all there in the narrative. It's there alongside the laws that are given. And so we see that man was created in God's image. That's in Genesis, one of the books of the law. Man was created in God's image. He is not the same as an animal. He is different. He is higher. He has dominion over the animals. When Noah comes off the ark, God says, you can now kill animals. They're for you to eat. So, if someone has a problem with killing animals because they don't want to kill an animal, it's okay for them not to, but they must never condemn someone else whom God has given the right to kill an animal. It's something that God has said is okay, but he's said it's not okay to murder a person. And again, in the context of the scripture, it tells us, even Jesus said, you're worth much more than a bunch of sparrows. The understanding that humans are above animals is there in Scripture. And in Genesis, he says, whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. So our understanding of murder actually comes from within the narratives there. We understand that after murder has taken place, God has to address the fact that murder has taken place. And he addresses it and he says, no, if someone sheds human blood, their blood will be shed. And the reason is God made man in his own image. And so we have a context now for the law as it's given. Even the Ten Commandments, when we look at them, they're presented within the context of a story. And God's chosen people, impatient, unfaithful, Aaron, people-pleasing, weak. Moses, glowing with the glory of God, coming down the mountain, burning with the zeal of having received the commandments of God, smashing the commandments, getting angry, the people, because they're so unfaithful, ultimately actually becoming the advocate for the people and an intercessor, a type of the Christ, who would stand in the gap so that God would not judge them and not cause them to come to destruction. There's a whole narrative that happens around even the giving of the law. And so we see that the narrative and the law can't be separated. They're together. They're together for a reason. Because God doesn't want us to have a rule book. People have said, no, the Bible, basic instructions before leaving earth. It's great, it preaches good. But the point is, it's not a rule book. The Bible is a story. It's a narrative. It's about a relationship between God and man. And so when we look at the law, we must never look at it and try and separate it out of that narrative. We need to see it in the context which it was intended. So what do we mean by the law? As always with the Bible, we mean several things. The Bible is one of those wonderful books that just means lots of things all the time. And so there's at least three main ways that we understand the law when we use the word the law and we're talking theology. The first is that we might be meaning the entire Old Covenant system. In 1 Corinthians 9, verse 20, Paul talks about those under the law, those outside the law. So he makes a distinction between those under the law and those outside the law. And basically he's talking about Jews and non-Jews, Jews and Gentiles. And he's basically saying anyone who was in that covenant is under the law. And so he's using it's probably the broadest understanding of what it would mean when we say the law. Paul is clearly referring to the whole covenant, the whole relationship with God that began through Abraham and continued through Moses, the thing that made a Jew Jewish and a non-Jew non-Jewish. And then it's also used to describe the first 5 books of the Bible. That's the Pentateuch. And when we did the books of the Bible, you remember those were all colored the same color, and they are all belonging to Moses. Moses wrote those books. And so often, because all these laws, these instructions were contained within those, they're understood to be the books of the law. Jesus calls them that. He refers to the law and the prophets in Luke 16:16, as if there was 2 volumes within the scriptures, the law and the prophets. In Joshua 1:8, just after Moses has disappeared from the scene, God speaks to Joshua and says, "This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall meditate on it day and night." This book of the law. In other words, this volume that's been handed to you from Moses. And so these collection of books, which are narratives, histories, law, they're also called the law. And then, of course, there's the law, which is the 600 plus commandments that were given to the people of Israel. And so we can understand it to mean that as well. In 1 Corinthians 9:8, Paul speaks of the law of Moses. Here he's speaking in a singular sense, because the law that is made of many parts is actually one law. James talks about this, James 2:10, where he says if you break one part of the law, you've broken it all. And so the law, if you were to talk about the law of this land, I was notified this week that I have a letter, something to do with speed of transit, and there's going to be funds required. I've broken the law. That makes me a lawbreaker. It actually is irrelevant which law I broke. I'm now basic criminal. Yeah. But the Lord is gracious, slow to anger, abounding in loving kindness. So that's good, because all of us are transgressors of the law. None of us is able to perfectly fulfill the law. And so we understand that, and we get to grips with that idea. Obviously, for this session, I'm primarily going to be using the term the law to actually mean like the legal aspects of the Pentateuch. So those legal and like portions of the scriptures, the bits that respond to different aspects of law. Something to understand about the law, and this is true even in society today, is that the law is covenant. In that sense, there's a contractual thing in the law. Now, all law actually in South Africa is like that. Not in all countries, but in South Africa it is. A covenant is a binding agreement between 2 parties. A modern day example would be a contract, similar, like marriage. But you could even look at something as simple as a cell phone contract, where there's that would be an example of a parity covenant, where you have something they want and they have something you want, and so you come to an agreement. It's the simplest form of contract. There's essentially 3 kinds of contract, and we'll just touch on this briefly, because it's not the most important thing to get tied up in knots over. But there is the parity. If those of you who play golf, you'll recognize the term par, even, equal, level. This is a covenant between 2 equal parties. And so where you have 2 equal parties, the parties can negotiate and arrive at the terms of agreement. It's a partnership, similar to a marriage covenant. And there's this deep-held kind of commitment, mutual benefits to each other. And so for most of us today, when we look at marriage today, that's how it's understood. Obviously, there are countries where it doesn't happen that way, but in a Western society where you have love matches, two equal partners coming together, being married, that would be an example of a parity covenant. And then we've got the suzerainty, or suzerainty, or however you want to say that, really. Looks like Susie Rain T. Covenant. Now, the whole book of Deuteronomy is structured in this kind of covenant. It's a covenant that's imposed by an all-powerful suzerain, or overlord, to a weaker, dependent vassal, which is the old word for servant or a serf, a peasant kind of person. So basically what you have is you have a lord and you have a vassal, and the lord sets the terms. It's not between equals. It's a commandment that the lesser party has no choice but to accept. If they break it, they're a transgressor. And so for the law, God gives the 10 Commandments, obviously. They were like a first installment. And then he gives 613 other laws and regulations that the Jews have to follow. He doesn't ask them if they're okay with it. It's not a recommendation. It's not open for renegotiation. God is God, and he is saying, this is how my people need to behave. And so this is this. And so there's a requirement within it from the lesser person. There's a requirement from the lesser person of certain expected behaviors. But they don't get to choose whether they participate in the covenant. They just participate by virtue of the fact that the other person is their Lord. And so that's totally fine if it's God. At the end of the day, God's good. So that's not going to lead to issues. But obviously, you can understand then when you see the narrative and you see the people sort of pushing against that and fighting against that, you understand some of the emotion they're processing, they're going through, because actually they've had this imposed on them. Although it's by a good God, if they don't understand it well, then you can see why they'd rebel. Because they'd say, well, we never had a choice. But I'm good. Yeah, but we didn't have a choice to see if you were good. Or we didn't decide you were good. You just told us you were good. And now you're making all these demands of us. Anyway, we'll come on to that. The promissory covenant is the next, or the covenant of grace as it's also known. This is again a legally binding promise given from one side only. In the case of the Abrahamic and the new covenant, it's from God's side, a gift to his people. Why was it that Abraham, of all the men on earth, was chosen to be the father of our faith? What was his great claim to fame? What was the fantastic thing he'd done? What was his imposing righteousness that caused him to come to the attention of God? No, nothing. He was just Abraham. He was just his guy. He's just there, and God says, I'm going to make you the father of many nations. Through you, all the nations of the world will be blessed. And Abraham goes, what, me? But we're not having kids. We tried that. It didn't work. There is no reason why Abraham is the ideal choice, but he's God's choice. And that's an example of a promissory covenant. God makes promises to Abraham. Just makes promises. Just big, massive, crazy big promises. Just makes them. And Abraham goes, okay. That's like all he has to do. He just, okay. And we know from Hebrews it was about faith. It wasn't about what Abraham then had to do. It wasn't commands. It wasn't laws. It was just, these are the promises. And then he had to live in the good of that. So why did God give the law? And I see this as part of your assessment, so hopefully I'm not going to give you all your answers here. I hope that your notes will be longer than mine when you hand in your assessment. But essentially, the law was given to establish Israel in right relationship with God, the nations around them, and with one another. So obviously they had to be in right relationship with God. They had to be in right standing with the nations around them. That doesn't mean they had to be friends with the nations. Some of the time it meant they had to be enemies with the nations. There was things out there that God didn't like, and they had to also not like those things. And they also had to have the right kind of relationship with one another. It's been said that God had taken them out of Egypt, but now God had to take the Egypt out of them. And so there was lifestyles that they were exposed to in Egypt which were not godly. There was ways of living, ways of being that were not what God desired. It's not true that God is happy with everyone. God may love everyone, but he loves them too much to leave them the way they are, all messed up and sinful. And so he has standards. And that was part of what the law is there to do. It's interesting, when we look at God, he's always been seeking relationship. And when we know Ephesians 1, it says, before the world began, he saw us, he chose us, he assigned us to be adopted into his family. That was what was going to give him great pleasure. And so when we look here, even in the Old Testament, what was God after? Well, he says in Exodus 6:7, he says, you're going to be my people. Now, I mean, I remember when we first came to South Africa, we were with some friends, and their daughter was just starting a new school. They'd come with us, and they said, no, she's going to be fine. The first day she comes home from school, she says, I made 5 new friends. And she'd literally made them her friends. She'd walked up to them and said, you're going to be my friend, and you're going to be my friend, and they all went, yes, miss. That was kind of it, you know. And God comes to these people. He says, you will be my people. I will be your God. He just chooses this people from Abraham. He chooses this people. He says, I will be your God. You will be my people. That's what I want. I actually want ownership of you. I want you to belong to me, but not as an overlord. Not as an all-power. He wasn't looking to exert authority and power. That was not his motive. In Leviticus 26, we see verses 12 and 13. He says, I want to walk among you. What was it that God did with Adam before he sinned? He walked with him. He walked with him in the cool of the day in the garden. Can you imagine? It's been thousands of years since he walked with Adam. He had that brief moment with Enoch, but then he was no more. And he just wants someone he can walk with. I mean, most days people walk with earphones in on a treadmill going nowhere. God invented walking. And he wanted to do it with people. He wanted to walk someplace with someone that he could have a conversation, that he could love, that he could have a relationship with. That was what God wanted. So he says, you're going to be my people. I want to be able to have someone to walk with. I want to walk with you. I want to journey with you. That's amazing. So he just does all that. He just hands that. In Deuteronomy, Moses, perhaps knowing that he's not going to be around much longer, starts to talk to the people about the law. Now, we've already had the 10 Commandments. He gives them all again. So you get it twice. And he unpacks the law to them again. He says, when your sons ask you in times to come, he's preparing them for the future, what is the meaning of the testimonies and the statutes and the rules that the Lord our God has commanded you? Then you shall say to your son, we were Pharaoh's slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. The Lord showed signs and wonders, great and grievous, against Egypt and against Pharaoh and all his household before our eyes. And he brought us out from there, that he might bring us in and give us the land that he swore to give to our fathers. And the Lord commanded us to do these statutes. 1, to fear the Lord our God. 2, for our good, always. 3, that he might preserve us alive as we are this day. 4, and it will be righteousness for us if we're careful to do all this commandment before the Lord our God as he has commanded us. Moses understood why they'd been given these commands. Now, this isn't necessarily an exhaustive explanation of why the law was given, but it indicates what Moses figured it was given for. He says, when your children down the road, when I'm gone, when I'm no longer here to explain, your children are going to ask questions, that you're going to be in the land. The land's already going to be yours. You're not going to be fighting. You're not going to be striving. You're not going to be pushing forward like we are now, hoping for something. You're already going to have it. And they're going to say, so why do we still need the law? We got what we wanted. Why do we still need the law? A lot of Christians saying that today. And we got what we wanted. We're saved, aren't we? Why do we still need the law? When people ask those questions, there is an answer. There is a reason. For the fear of the Lord. Fear of the Lord. That's one of the reasons the law is given. When you realize how picky God is, it's terrifying. When you know that he has not just the power to destroy your body, but to take your soul and cast it into hell. That's phenomenal. For our good, always. Not one portion of the law was designed for Israel's ill. Every portion was for their good. That's phenomenal. That's amazing. I mean, people have sort of demystified many parts of the law now by saying, well, actually, if you look at this, it's just really good sort of like food hygiene and stuff like that. And in some ways it demystifies, but it doesn't, because what Moses is saying here is every portion of the law was for our good. And so there are aspects of the law as food hygiene. It was for their good. That's how they prospered. That's how they didn't get sick like other nations and die from rotten meats and things. They had better systems for those things. God wanted to preserve the people. The law was not there to destroy the people. And sometimes we think, no, because the Bible says the letter kills, but the Spirit gives life. So was the law there to destroy the people? No. It was there to preserve the people. How? Well, work it out. Put it in your assignment. But the law is there to preserve, and it will be righteousness to them. Again, not righteousness by works. It's never righteousness by works. The law doesn't save the people. It's interesting, if we're going to do the whole narrative thing, what is coming out of Egypt? Ultimately, it is a picture of their salvation. What is passing through the Red Sea? Ultimately, it is a form of a baptism where they come through the waters. Therefore, the law is only given after they're saved. It's not how they're saved. They're saved by the grace of God. They're saved just because God wanted to. It says that they were in Egypt and God remembered them and he saved them. He sent Moses. God didn't send the law to save them. They were saved by faith in God, just as we always are. Now it is evident, Galatians says, that no one is justified before God by the law, for the righteous shall live by faith. In Galatians, Paul is quoting Habakkuk, Old Testament prophet, who wrote, the righteous will live by his faith. And so when we see that, we see, no, even in the old, it was understood, but the righteous live by faith. They don't live by works. We don't attain salvation by our works. And so in a true sense, they were looking forward to a Messiah, just as we look back to a Messiah who's already come. They were looking forward, we're looking backward. It's the same Messiah, it's the same salvation. They receive salvation in the same way that we do, not by being perfect in the law. Let's look at the law as three parts. I think Michael unpacks some of this later as well. For the sake of clarity, theologians have often divided the law into three parts. Now, if you remember when we talked about division, when we were talking about philosophy in one of the other modules, division is not a good thing when you're looking at the Bible. Don't divide. Okay, you can make distinctions, but divisions can be unhelpful because then you start to separate things like teachings on spirit, soul, and body, where they're understood to be separate items instead of just distinct items. And so we need to understand the difference between division and distinction. It's been said that if I define your spirit and your body, I do you no harm. If I divide your spirit and your body, I've killed you. Okay, so understand the difference between a distinction and a division. We don't divide the law up. The law is one. Paul refers to the law in the singular. And so the law is understood as one. but there are different aspects within the law. And so there are different things which people have put labels on. We're going to look at some of those labels now. They've called one portion the moral law, primarily the Ten Commandments, those aspects which relate to how we should live to be good and to be nice. And so that's the moral law. Then there's the ceremonial law. This is again primarily relating to the types and symbols found in the sacrificial system. The ceremonies. There were many festivals and ceremonies. Obviously, the first one that they experienced, even coming out of Egypt, was the Passover. That was given to them right away, even before the rest of the law. But it was kept in there. And so they continued to celebrate that. But other festivals were added to that. And so it built up and built up over time through Moses, the ceremonial law. And then there was the civil law. Stuff about slavery and jubilees and land barriers, like boundaries, like where the boundary line should be, not moving boundary lines, stuff like that. The plot of land next to us, you'll see if you come in daylight, it's got some stakes in the ground at the moment. The surveyor has just been next door and he was just checking the boundary lines are in the right place because they're looking at what can happen with that property and a new use for that property. And so they have to look at the boundaries and make sure that the law covers that. But that's not moral law, that's not ceremonial law, it's civil law. And so those things are covered in Scripture. And so again, we remember the distinction is good, division is bad. But when we see these things, we see a lot of overlap. So if we use an example, for example, the fourth commandment about the Sabbath day, it's found in the moral law. So it's found in the Ten Commandments, which is understood to be moral. But it's also certainly part of the ceremonial system of Jewish holy days. So it also is found in the ceremonial law. Now, the ceremonial law of the ceremonies of the days, the different days, that would have had an impact on civil society. Because if you're giving everyone a day off, that impacts on civil society. So the Sabbath impacts not just the moral, but also the ceremonial and the civil. So we can see you can't easily define these things, but it is helpful for us to understand the way that the different laws impacted on areas of life and society. So it's there. It's not as defined as some would like to define it, but it is there, and it is helpful for us to understand. But the reason why these distinctions are not divisions is similar to the whole thing of narrative. And again, the answer is even found within the narrative. When Adam and Eve were created, what were they created for? Not to be religious. Not to just worship God and observe holy festivals. They weren't created just to have a kind of perfect community that ran smoothly. Good civil law. No, Adam and Eve were created to have a relationship with God, to walk with him in the garden, to have communion with him. And the law was looking to restore that. And so it's not the same as other law documents because it's about relationship. If to us, life with God is simply a moral obligation or a system of religious customs or a sense of civic duty, then we're doing it wrong. And if any of us take the law and turn it into that, then that's definitely a mistake. So Jesus, during a battle of wits between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, was asked this question, what is the greatest command? And he summarized 5 books of the Bible with 2 simple sentences. And so I'm going to do the same for you now, because we've divided it 3 ways. You could divide it 10 ways, but actually you can divide it 2 ways. The first, Jesus said, okay, I'm going to answer your question. What's the greatest law? He said, I'm not going to answer it with one, though there's no one great command, although there is the greatest command, which is, of course, to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. But there's also a second great command, which is like it, he said, which is that you shall love your neighbor as yourself. He finishes by saying, on these 2 commandments depend all the law and the prophets. So not just the law, but the prophets as well depend on just these 2 sentences of Scripture. You think that's amazing. So if you want to summarize, basically that's almost the entire Old Testament You can do it in 2 sentences, and Jesus did that. It's another example of God's wonderful efficiency, economy. He's able to summarize the Old Testament into basically 2 sentences. Love God, love your neighbor. But when you think about it, it makes total sense. I mean, that basically is everything we need to do. If you were to apply that rule to every decision you make in your life, is this loving towards God? And does this display love to my neighbor? Then you would never put a foot wrong. You'd never lie, cheat, steal, commit adultery. You'd never have other gods before him. You'd always observe the Sabbath. I mean, you'd just do everything God wanted because that's loving him. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commandments. That carries through into the new. We understand that to still be the way that God thinks. And what's known as the golden rule, do unto others as you'd have them do unto you. We have the benchmark found in Scripture for how we're to treat others. You treat them as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. And so that is how we understand the law. And this works as well. I mean, Jesus said it. It works with the 10 Commandments. If we look at the 10 Commandments and we split them basically into 2 portions, the ones for the hashtag love God and the others for hashtag love people, then what we see that the first 4 essentially relate towards God. Although Jesus did say what we do to people, we do for him as well. As much as you do for the least of these, you do for me. But the first 4 essentially relate to God. So you'll have no other gods before me. You'll not make idols. You'll not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. And you'll remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. That's all to do with our relationship with God and loving him. And then there's the relationship with others. So it starts at birth. We've got to honor our mother and our father. And then your brother comes along. So now you shall not murder. And then you grow up and get married. So now you shall not commit adultery. And once you're running a house, well, now you mustn't steal. You mustn't bear false witness against your neighbor next door. And you mustn't covet all the stuff he's got there, including his wife and his donkey, whichever is more useful to you. So God's commands fall very much into this relationship and this relationship. They handle both. But if we just love God and love people, we'd get it all right. And so Jesus is right. We can summarize it all in those ways. We've got to remember that commandments 5 through 10 are great commands, and anyone could live that way, and it would be wonderful. But you'd just be a benevolent humanist if you don't take commandments 1 through 4 as well. See, half the world is trying to be good, and they're not stealing, and they're not committing adultery, but unless they don't have any other gods before him, unless they give themselves to him, then they've missed the whole point. They might as well be bad. Paul said, if we're only going to be, rewarded in this life, then we're to be more pitied than all men. He knew it was more fun to have a bad time than a good time. Or having a good time was often the same as having a bad time. The law of God is about relationship. So it was designed to reveal God to us, and it was designed so that God would be revealed through us. When it does, we become a city on a hill, a light that cannot be hidden. We display his glory to the world because we become like him. Children of God, which is what we are. Amen.